All right. Good morning, everybody, and thank you for attending our Wake Up with Windows 10. Today we're going to go over 3 key milestones that myself and my team feel are important as we're preparing for a Windows 10 project. So I am Emily Carlson, and I am a principal consultant with Divergent. I've been with the organization for just over 4 years. I run our technology practice, so all things Microsoft and infrastructure fall to myself and my team. And on the phone with me today, I have Jose Maldonado, Mike Bright, and Jeff Baker. And together we will go through these 3 key milestones that we feel all projects should remember to include with their Windows 10 projects. So Jose, would you like to advance to the next slide and do a quick introduction?
Absolutely. Good morning, Emily. Good morning to everyone.
All right, Jose, why don't you tell everybody a little bit about yourself?
Okay, my name is Jose Maldonado. I am a Microsoft senior consultant. So, like Emily explained, pretty much all things Microsoft. I've been working in the operating system deployment for a while. I have a total of 15 plus years experience. I have deployed Windows Vista, Windows 7, Windows 10. Um, I've been hovering in the Windows 10 area and kind of expanding that based on all the new cloud components that Windows 10 brought about, all the changes for Active Directory, the cloud, Azure, and Office 365, and now Microsoft 365. And it looks like we're going to be working with this for a while.
Great, thank you. And you've been with us for almost 2 years, right, Jose?
Almost 2, yes. It's been a great experience, actually. Very interesting.
Yeah, awesome. Hey, Mike, you want to do a quick introduction?
Sure. Good morning. My name is Mike Bright. I am a consultant with Divergent and have officially been on board for right around 3 months, but have worked with the team for, just about 2 years on other projects unofficially. I've got right around 15 years in healthcare IT experience, anything from operations management, project management, acquisitions, and some OS migrations, Windows XP to 7. 7 to 10. So similar to Jose's background, but I'm a Jedi in training. Unlike Jose, he has already mastered the Force. So appreciate the time.
Not true. The Force is unattainable. You're always in search of it.
All right, and Jeff, have you had the chance to join? Okay, Jeff Baker is a manager within our technology practice. He has been with the organization for just about the same time. Actually, Jose and Jeff together they had their first day. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, so that was great. Very much well versed in all things Microsoft. Many different certifications. Resides in Indianapolis and is really a very strong technical component of our team, and we're very lucky to have him as well. Okay, Jose, let's move to the next slide. All right, so one thing that I think we see repeatedly with Windows 10 projects is issues around application rationalization. The team and I actually started to get into this conversation this morning regarding application rationalization versus application compatibility and one lending to the other. So, we know that as you start a Windows 10 project, one of the most difficult things is actually getting a catalog of your applications and being able to understand really what's in the environment. So Jose, what are some of your thoughts around application rationalization and the right approaches, and just what are your thoughts?
Okay, so what I've seen in organizations when they are contemplating and pre-planning for a Windows 10 migration, and I'm only referencing Windows 10 because that's the level of OS we are now, they take application rationalization a bit too lightly. I think that whole applications realm, it's not looked at with the same scrutiny. It's not taken into consideration um, like they do the operating system. So I've seen where an organization with about 6,000 devices, they were going to roll out Windows. At the time, it was Windows 7, and they had spent about 6 months on application rationalization and then app compatibility. But when they began to roll out Windows 10, about 2 months into it, I'm sorry, Windows 7, about 2 months into it, they had to put a pause in the migration because the applications work had not been completed, and they ran into some snags. That particular company was an oil and gas company, and just like in healthcare, they have applications that they might not be complex in nature, but it could be some sort of in-house application, or it could be one of those one-offs where there's a vendor involved that may have to submit a certain solution, or um, the right programming switches to be able to deploy that application, and it can cause a big snag in the actual deployment of Windows. So depending on the size of your software catalog, depending on how many users use certain applications, there's a certain approach and there's a certain timeline that should be attached to application rationalization and app compatibility. And I think it's under the application umbrella, and it should probably be done in 2 or 3 phases. But that needs to be added to the timeline of or a company's migration timeline of an OS, where there be a pre-migration phase or whatever you want to call it. But I've seen companies work probably close to a year sometimes, right? So if you have a smaller software catalog, it may only take you 6 months, right? But it's definitely a crucial step that sometime is missed when it comes to OS deployment and migrations.
So Jose, why do you think it sometimes gets missed? And Mike, I mean, what do we think about why, why with the importance attached to this topic, why do you think it might get missed?
Well, let me just answer that quickly, and then I do want to defer to Mike because as an insider, he probably can give a more in-depth answer to that question. But I think it's because sometimes you, I think it's budgetary reasons. A lot of times that might be like the number one cause, right? Because if we're going to migrate to a certain Windows operating system, we want to attach a timeline to that, and then with the timeline we'll say we're going to need some sort of staff augmentation. We may have to hire a consulting firm, and so we have X amount of dollars, right, that we're going to dedicate to the project. So if the company looks at it, well, it'll take us maybe 1 year or 12 months to migrate 6,000 users over to Windows 10. They don't look at that, okay, it may take us 8 months to do the application work, and they're not looking at it where, okay, so this is really not a 1 year project, it's an 18-month project.
So Jose, I think you I think you hit the nail on the head. I think a lot of it has to do with it's a very overwhelming process, right? So when you start to peel the layers off that onion, you find applications in your environment you didn't even know existed. So you're scrambling to find application owners to do that validation, to find out if the application is compatible, if there's updates, if they can be applied, and that sort of thing. A lot of time is focused on operations, and the I guess the maintenance, the keeping up with the applications kind of falls by the wayside. So I think the culture needs to shift to where application rationalization becomes an iterative process that happens every X amount of months. So that way we're staying on top of it, especially as Windows becomes a service and not just an operating system, because those applications will need to be vetted and tested for each one of these feature updates.
Yeah, so that's correct, Mike. So I look at it kind of if I'm taking a trip from let's say New York to Miami, and the map says it's a 24-hour drive, right? So let's just say I can drive 24 hours straight without falling asleep. But people don't take into consideration sometimes, or the map doesn't tell you, hey, you're gonna have to stop for fuel, you're gonna have to stop to eat, and you may get tired and have to take a 2-hour power nap, right? So you have to add that to the trip. So when I take road trips personally, I think of, okay, this is a 10-hour drive. I may have to stop, 4 times, and then I need extra amount of time for, to pick up some food, or, and get off the main path. And then, after that break, get back on and continue on. So that way I can measure and gauge exactly what my timeline is going to be. And it's still an approximation, right? And that's why we hire project managers and project coordinators to kind of keep us on track and kind of sift through things and prioritize the items in the order in which they should go, and then even reprioritize when there are some snags or some unforeseen risks that arise. But yeah, so I think that's pretty much it. And because it's taken so lightly, it's it's definitely something to contend with. Even if your software catalog only has 300 titles, you have to really take a look at the application work first before you start planning the migration. I mean, whether you have great or engineers, or just engineers that have under 5 years experience that are going to be building your Windows image or images and task sequences, that's only part of the work. Because once you begin deploying, you can pick up momentum and start the transformation, right? But if it's not ready, if you don't have the ingredients ready, then the meal at some point you have to turn off the fire on the frying pan and go back to gathering all the ingredients and preparing everything.
Yeah. So and to touch on deployment, I think another thing that gets overlooked too is how you're deploying the applications, right? So if you've got a catalog of applications that are being deployed, let's say through SCCM or some other tool, and they're deploying, zero touch to your desktops during the imaging process of the task sequence, or however that process is working in your environment, those applications may not install the same way on Windows 10 or from 1803 to 1903 or whatever the version changes may be. So that needs to be looked at as well.
Yeah, and so let me ask you both a question. So why do you think IT departments and organizations are still in a reactive mode versus a proactive mode?
I can tell you in my experience, is because they're running so lean that most of the time they only have the ability to put out fires and keep the doors open, and not to be able to be innovative or to put that preventative maintenance time in. They're running around trying to put out fires and save the world, really, in my experience.
Okay. No, so that I get that part. So it makes me think of like the Windows XP days. And Windows XP was a long running OS, right? And I think we became very complacent where, hey, we have this OS. There are not a lot of changes. There are going to be some service packs, and that's probably, that's the highest level of complexity, right? And then Microsoft began releasing some other OSs. I actually saw one company deploy Vista Business. It was just one company that where I was a part of the project that went to Vista. Windows 8 that I don't know many companies went to. That's where all the cloud components were introduced. Again, Windows 7 was an extension of Vista. Anything that worked with Vista would work with 7 essentially, right? And I think that most organizations thought that, again, it's the same thing, right? We can go from XP. Now we're on Vista. from Vista, you could actually upgrade to 7 if you wanted to. You couldn't upgrade from XP to Vista, but the even the deployment approach, right, using WIMs and things of that nature, that started with Windows Vista. So when Windows 8 came out, it was so different. Companies did not even look at it, right? But it's still part of the path and the roadmap that got us to Windows 10. So Windows 10 is so different that I think that a lot of IT departments have had to begin waking up and saying, we can't take this, I don't know, we can't take this coasting approach because so many things are different where now we're going to have to put all these new things in place. And then because Windows 10 has these feature updates, which we'll talk about later, we have to kind of stay proactive. So how do you think we can change the mindset of some IT departments to start thinking proactive where we have to make sure Active Directory and the infrastructure can support Windows 10 or the newer features that are coming out? And then we have group policy, ADMX templates. A lot of organizations would not even use ADMX templates, right? And I think you've experienced that too, Mike, where some of the companies in the past you've worked on and worked for did not use ADMX templates, and they wanted to kind of issue out single policies here and there that were not truly tailored for the Windows 10 operating system.
Yeah, absolutely. So to answer your question or to address it in some way, I guess, back to my point, this needs to be an iterative process. So every time we have one of these feature updates, it needs to be treated almost as if it's a full-blown deployment. The work has to be done. Everything needs to be vetted and tested, and IT needs to understand that this has to be a proactive approach. Not that it's as complex as a 7 to 10 migration, but it should be treated as such. That way, that mindset starts to get ingrained where we are being proactive and we're doing the work up front, and we're keeping our asset management stuff up to date. We're cataloging our applications. We know what's out there, and we know what plays nicely with the next flavor of Windows that we're moving to.
Yeah, and Mike, I'm just going to jump in here. So I also, you touched upon it, the governance process. So I think one thing that is really difficult to get to as you're even starting a Windows 10 project and you're looking at application rationalization is a true catalog of what's really in the environment. So once that's been completed, the governance structure around adding applications into the environment so that they're included in the testing for the feature updates and ongoing maintenance of your environment is key. That allows you to really ensure that nothing breaks, right?
Right, because we've all seen that an organization has 3 or 4 pieces of software that if they had just worked with the departments that were purchasing it, they realized they already had that functionality in their inventory.
Yeah, and I've been sitting across the conference room table from clients where when you explain to them, okay, so because Windows 10 is going to continue to evolve, right, along, and let's set aside Azure and all the cloud components, right, Office 365, which many companies have adopted Office 365, but there are a lot of companies that have not. So when I say now that you are migrating to Windows 10, there's going to be something that gets put on I don't want to say priority list, but it is priority. This should be always a resource that his or her job is going to be to continue developing and engineering and keeping up with what the new versions of Windows 10 are going to bring and the changes. And that involves a lot of with group policy, right? So Microsoft recommends, and even some of the top gurus that work in modern desktop arena, they say that you should always have the ADMX template that matches your version of Windows 10. So you have AD folks or Active Directory admins that have been, working in Active Directory since dating back to when it was born in Windows 2000 server, right? And they continue to have that mindset where we need a certain policy, we're just going to pull the policy from somewhere and add it, and not take into consideration that what about how do we govern, how do we manage all the other features of Windows 10? How do we manage the features that the newer features that come out with the next version of Windows 10? And how about the policies that are deprecated, right? Or the features that are deprecated with each new version. So in order to manage, you have to kind of keep up with the modern desktop strategy, right, and technology. So it's a hard concept, or it's difficult for a lot of organizations to go through that mental shift, right? But again, it goes back to being proactive is probably the best approach at this particular time. And I do know that that modern desktop is something new. It may seem strange. It may seem difficult, like a tall mountain to climb, right? But there are ways to kind of ease those pains, especially using the modern desktop approach when it comes to, let's say, group policy, right? So we want to make customizations to the operating system, to Windows 10. So many people out there are writing PowerShell scripts to do this, to do that, in the task sequence as they deploy Windows 10. So it's kind of like customization on demand, right? But the problem is that same script that you wrote for Windows 10 1703 may not work for 1709. And if it does, it may not work for 1803 or 1809, right? So if we leverage group policy, where group policy manages those customizations until that policy or that feature is deprecated, it will continue to work also for your feature updates. And again, so that's the challenge. The challenge really isn't to manage your Windows 10 desktop environment. It's basically adopting a newer approach where we kind of set it and forget it, but at the same time, still we're working on what's coming out next.
Okay, so Jose, you mentioned the ongoing maintenance of group policy. So, we've talked about application rationalization and, keeping the catalog up to date as new things are added. It sounds like almost an approach for group policies is something similar, right? So being able to keep track and that same type of governance structure from a policies perspective that we're talking about for applications may be something that organizations want to think about as they're going through their Windows 10 projects. What do you think?
Yes, so that's another area I've seen where, and I mentioned this yesterday at a meeting, I've seen where organizations were dumping their Windows 7 devices into the same OU as their Windows 10 devices, and then they were wondering why Windows 10 was broken when they deploy it to a workstation. And the truth is, the answer is group policy, right? The same policies that apply to Windows 7 do not apply to Windows 10. And some of those policies, those legacy policies, can hinder functionality in Windows 10. Windows 10 has a store and it has Microsoft Edge, right? And there's certain things that you can disable, but you can't uninstall these things, right? So if there's a conflict in the policy, and let's say it is breaking the Windows Store, but you say we don't use the Windows Store. I understand you don't use the Windows Store, you don't plan to. However, there are other features, there's other functionality that stems from that Windows Store component inside of the operating system. So planning out group policy, taking into consideration whatever your current AD OU structure is, and possibly modifying that, or even planning an AD redesign is something that companies need to take a very good look at, because applications, I mean, obviously if your users don't have the proper applications, it will impact the business. But if the workstations are not working or functioning properly, that also impacts the business because they, now users can't work. So users can't work without a workstation working properly, and they can't work if the applications are not right. So this is also a big component. I know we didn't put it up here today. We only had a limited amount of time. If we were going to discuss Windows 10 as a whole, we'd probably have to rent an arena and have a week's convention, right? To kind of tackle that. But
Yep. A lot
yeah,
of Starbucks needs to be consumed too for that topic.
Yep. But yeah. So yes, Emily, Active Directory is a big piece when it comes to Windows 10, managing Windows 10 and deploying Windows 10. And it's something that we need to kind of understand what the modern day approach is.
Yeah.
And that's another piece that I've seen bring a project to a screeching halt, for sure.
Yeah, absolutely.
To its knees.
So I think the three of us could probably talk all day about application rationalization and some of the other areas that we can, think of when we're trying to plan out Windows 10 projects and the gotchas and the governance behind it and the next steps that have to occur when an organization moves over to Windows 10. But let's start talking about encryption.
Okay, so before we leave this slide, I just want to point out the blurb at the top right. That says 70% of CIOs believe that 1/5 of their applications need consolidation, eliminating redundant functionality, and how these applications that are seldomly used or never used or overlooked cost organizations millions. So that's probably why we kind of picked this particular topic today, to kind of point out how important the application rationalization process is prior to a Windows 10 migration.
Yeah, I also, when we're thinking through these topics, it is one that a lot of time needs to be spent on in the upfront area of the project, right? There's a cost savings associated with the rationalization projects, but unfortunately, it is sometimes an overlooked, very large part of a large program like Windows 10. So it's definitely something. Like I said, I think all of us could probably spend a whole day talking on, and certainly something that I think all of us have seen as one of those gotchas in the large programs. So let's talk about encryption. So, what are your thoughts on encryption, you guys? What do we got here?
So I can start a little bit on that. Right now, most organizations are encrypting mobile devices. Obviously, those are the easiest type of device to come up missing or to leave in the trunk of your car and the next morning you come out there not there. But I know you guys have seen this as well. The desktop models that are being deployed out and some of these enterprise environments are becoming increasingly smaller and quite honestly are easier to pick up and take home with you than a laptop. So just kind of wanted to get some discussion around that really. Mobile devices have been the main focus for encryption, but I think that mindset needs to shift to where we're actually encrypting almost all of the devices, really, to be honest with you.
Yeah, I think an M910 actually would fit in my purse easier than my laptop. So the fact that we think of an M10 and a desktop as something as a very large tower that is safe and cannot be placed, and cannot be picked up easily and removed from an area. That mindset's got to change, right, you guys? Because the devices are getting smaller, and it's still a desktop, but it's actually smaller than most laptops.
No, someone who wants to steal some sort of computer device. I believe that there was an incident that we're all have knowledge of, where if you can't take the device out of one of those mobile medical carts, just roll the cart right out of the hospital, right? And so that's how blatant theft can be. So encryption is a good idea across the board, right? But Mike, I'm going to give it back to you, but I just want to say the encryption is, not, to me, it's not a good idea if you don't have a way of managing it. So we should encrypt everything, right? But we also need that management layer, and that's probably key. And I think Mike is going to speak to that.
Right. Yeah. So you need to have visibility of what you have in your environment. In the event that you do have an incident, I mean, it's just going to happen. It's one of those things. You need to be able to report to risk or internal auditor or whatever that governing body is that, hey, yes, this device did leave the organization. We do not have a record of it or a chain of custody, but we can guarantee that it was encrypted based on securities parameters, whether that's, and I don't want to put anybody to sleep, but if it's AES 256 or XTS or whatever the encryption algorithm is, we need to be able to report that back and when those incidents do happen. So kind of a segue into what encryption method should be employed. That could be what, we could talk about the cipher strength, whole disk or U space. I know in a lot of the healthcare organizations, they prefer the whole disk encryption in the event that if the device is reused or reimaged, there's not the potential for that data to be recovered. If the device is reimaged, those sectors could be possibly recovered off that drive. So that's kind of where I wanted to take this discussion. And Jose, I heard you trying to chime in. Sorry.
Yeah. So let me ask you a question. So can you give us an example of poor encryption management?
Poor encryption. So sure. So it goes back to group policy, right? So if you're setting up your environment to get ready for the migration to Windows 10, and you're deploying group policies that are requiring, let's say, that XTS AES encryption, but your endpoints out in the field, and MBAM's been updated and such, but if your endpoints out in the field do not have that client side piece, and MBAM does not know the cipher strength that the new devices are running, so you're using a deprecated GPO, and then they're coming back non-compliant, right? So you need to make sure that your environment supports what you're trying to do. So if we're going to report on Windows 7 devices with an AES 256 cipher strength, they need to be segregated from the Windows 10 devices that are deploying the higher cipher strength. So that way, when you go to your whatever tool you're using to monitor that, you're getting an accurate report back. Hey, this device is compliant, or encryption cipher strength unknown. We need to be able to have that information to provide, like I said, to risk or whoever that governing body is in case there isn't an event. So that's kind of my thoughts on that, Jose. I think it goes down to your point is making sure that you're appropriately applying group policy to the right type of device and accomplishing what you're trying to accomplish.
Yeah, I've seen during a Windows 7 migration where something went wrong with BitLocker, or actually with MBAM, which is the tool that manages BitLocker. So BitLocker can work standalone, right? Where the key is saved somewhere, probably by the user, and then there's BitLocker where it's managed through MBAM. And now administrators have the keys stored somewhere. So if you're locked out of your device, you call the help desk and they can give you the key to unlock your device. But I've seen it where users had to put in this key every single time. What is it, about 30 characters or something like that?
Yeah.
So we ended up having to re-image about 200 devices because of after we identified and had to troubleshoot the whatever the issue was in MBAM. And the thing is, after the issue was corrected, the workstations were still affected by the initial problem. So that's why we had to re-image, and re-imaging kind of took care of it. But again, we had to spend time troubleshooting, and then we had to backtrack and re-image 200 devices, which, at the time just wasn't a quick process, right? So, but that's the thing. So now you're talking about the user cannot get into their device at all, right? So again, it impacts their ability to do their work, which, essentially, when you're talking about 200 different users, it's impacting the business. Now the business can't move forward because there's no functionality at the end user workstation level.
Right. And I've seen a similar situation where it did end up being a bug from Microsoft where a certain protector, and this is still in the BitLocker realm, but a certain protector that triggers that recovery event was being turned on where it was not by default previously. And that was not mentioned in the documentation. So it did end up being a bug for Microsoft, but because group policy was not configured correctly, and the organization did not make a decision on whether or not they should enable or disable that feature, or that protector, I should say, sorry, devices were throwing the recovery key error every morning, and users were not able to work. So
this is a good example too of leveraging group policy versus using some sort of PowerShell script in your deployment task sequence, because you can set the encryption method level, cipher strength in your group policy, and it will apply, right? I mean,
Right.
NBAM has its own policies as well, right? So again, this is where group policy can be leveraged so that we're not always rewriting scripts, troubleshooting scripts, because I mean, I don't know, I don't know of an engineer, an architect, a solutions expert that has written a complicated script or put together, a complex task sequence, or sometimes even a basic task sequence where it worked the first time, right? But these are things that you have to take into consideration. And what I mean by that is, so look at what we've discussed here today. We've discussed so far application rationalization, application compatibility, Active Directory and group policy. Now we're talking about encryption, right? But it's not just about applying encryption on an existing workstation. How do we roll all these things out? How do we get to having a Windows 10 gold image, right? So there's a roadmap to get there, and there's a lot of pre-work, and the pre-work is almost, to me, it's more critical than the deployment, because what you're deploying usually is a silver or gold image, which means it's either a final image or it's in its final stages, right? So a silver image will still work. It just means there might be a few components added after the fact. But if the front work isn't done, if the footwork isn't done, your deployment will not go smoothly, and you'll be kicking yourself in the head. And
Yeah.
Go ahead, Emily.
And I honestly think, based on what we've seen, Jose, encryption and the security governance, I'll go back to governance, because again, a lot of organizations have had the same policies in place where it's just secure laptops. Well, now as you're starting to think about the different devices and compatibility and standardization, it's a good time to talk about what you're encrypting. So to your point, doing this upfront work as part of your planning phase of a project should be the heavier lift, right? Because then by the time you get to deployment, it's truly deployment. It's truly, going into SCCM and pushing the image and having a solid end product, because you spent the time in the planning phase. So I think, Mike, you can dust off that PMP of yours and go back and remember, the phases of course of the project where this should be a heavy lift, right?
Absolutely. Yeah. So, and to touch on the governance piece, Emily, I think a lot of the different facets of IT are starting to become siloed. So the culture of security now, especially in healthcare, is so strong. So we tend to want to turn on every feature, every protection. If it's an option or a feature we can turn on and we can make the desktop more secure, let's turn it on. And I think we need to work together. Again, going back to governance, with desktop engineering, application support, field services. If we're overdoing it and we make the device so secure that we can't even manage it, then we've got a problem. So there's a delicate balance, and I think governance is key, and getting the right players involved in that planning process to make sure that the end user experience is correct and what the organization is looking for is key to a smooth deployment.
Yeah, and I think one of the takeaways from this is if you're out there and you have a PMP that you haven't used in a while, you should always dust it off every once in a while.
That's right.
One thing I'd like to add, though, too, this is Jeff, is that
Jeff,
if you're using that NBAM portal, there is a self-service recovery key, so the end user doesn't have to call the help desk. it helps out with the management of everything. So, or you can store it in Active Directory and have your help desk person help them out. So that's one thing I was really wanting to stress about the encryption and the management and monitoring of it.
Yeah, and that's a good point. So self-service modality for an organization is going to be key, right? So as certain things are rolled out, ensuring that there's almost that self-service for your end users to be able to, to also help lessen the impact to your help desk. So,
Okay. So
yeah.
I wanted to add, and I know we're spending probably a little bit too much time on this, but it is, equally as important as all the other parts. But no, so what we do as consultants, right? We come in and we do the work, right? But now we're hearing words like transformative and transformational, right? So just like we transform a client's environment, we also have to be able to transform and to help them with that, to make that mental shift and to be able to manage the whatever we put into place. So we design, engineer, create, implement these solutions, right? So that's where the proper training has to go into effect. So you want to train them on, if need be, managing group policy, and you want to leave them with best practices, industry best practices, right? When it comes to the feature updates, when it comes to endpoint encryption. So now we have to train the staff where it may not just be one session, right? So we might have to get to a certain point in the project where every week we spend 45 minutes with some sort of team where we're training them on how to manage and support these solutions that we're implementing, right? So what I've seen in migrations is you got the help desk that already takes in a certain amount of calls, right? And we already know that depending on how lean that particular department is, they may be busy most of the time. So now we're trying to migrate 6,000 users over to Windows 10, which means now there's going to be an influx of Windows 10 help desk tickets, right? And it could be for trivial things. So there's two pieces to that. The piece of communicating and training the end user, and communicating and training the IT staff to prepare for that, right? And that's outside of the guidance and leadership and the training that has to occur in other areas, like I just mentioned with engineering and administrators and so on and so forth. So it becomes a spectrum of services, not just set it and forget it. You don't know how many times I've walked into onto a Windows 10 migration project, and I said, okay, so where's your documentation for Windows 7? Well, we don't have any. They just came, they did it, and they left. Right? Okay, and all I have to go on is the pain points of the client, but we're basically having to create something new without figuring out exactly how they achieved the last migration, right? And don't get me wrong, we can do that, but at the same time, there's always a lot more gotchas or a more complexity when you don't know the history of something, right? As you're in the present trying to guide them into the future.
Yeah, well, let's go back to application rationalization. So if you look at organizations that went to Windows 7, so during their Windows 7 deployment, they should have had that catalog of applications, and at that point in time, put in that governance structure. That's a perfect world, but I think because we're so resource constrained in the industry, I think because people are having to wear multiple hats, and it's just such a busy time, that the original application rationalization spreadsheet or, wherever it was housed, gets forgotten about, and, then you're starting from scratch. So I think that's a good point, Jose, is the documentation component with these large programs. Even if you look at like a project plan, being able to go back and better forecast, what we did for 7 and project for our timelines for 10. So I think it's a very fair point to, as we're going through the programs, especially ones of this size and magnitude for an organization, to always look at that documentation to help partner with each of the end user community groups, as well as your internal IT teams, to make sure that they're they're trained up on what it takes to support the environment.
And I think that documentation should be a living, breathing document. So we're constantly, and again, I'll keep using the word iterative. We're constantly going back. We're updating that documentation and keeping it current. We're not just going to stick it on a shelf like one of the old encyclopedias that you've probably got in the back of the house collecting dust or something. So it's got to be continuously updated, and it's got to stay current.
So like an IT
And that
deployment
document needs to be
constitution.
added to the document needs also include, around the Windows 10, but needs to be included around the server environment too. Because as Jose brought up earlier in the conversation about application and the GPOs, making sure you're on the right template for the GPOs is because Microsoft now is starting to include disabled and enabled devices that back when Windows 7 was deployed, they've just automatically enabled it now. And so you no longer need the GPOs for that. So that really needs to be documented also.
And if you think the Windows 10 modern desktop technology has become more complex or stranger than fiction, right? The server environment is as well, right? So to me, I could manage server 2012, I could manage server 2016, and that was a little different, right? But I actually enjoyed that transition. But then with server 2019, again, it's another shift, right? That pushes us closer to becoming almost all cloud. And there's so many different aspects of it that you can't just decipher it at a glance. So I may be able to go into a Windows 10 project where there is no documentation for Windows 7 or the engineering of the Windows 7 image. I can go into whatever their task sequence is and whatever the management tool they have. I can decipher a lot of things, right? But I may not understand the rationale behind the decisions that they made to go to or use a specific strategy. I won't be able to decipher why things were decided for Active Directory changes or group policy or things of that nature, right? So in working for this particular consulting firms and other firms, I've noticed that documentation is at this point extremely important, and I've typed up documentation that was 179 pages and emailed it to all of the executives, and I heard one executive says, yeah, well, I got the documentation and I signed off on it because when I opened it I saw 179 pages and I just closed it, right? So it might not be that important to executives at the time, but it is. But it's really leaving those breadcrumbs so that when the next migration comes, not only your in-house engineering teams, but any outside firm can partner with you and give you the adequate product solution and support that you need.
That's a good point.
Yeah. All right. So I know we've touched upon many areas of operationally supporting Windows 10. So if we go to our last topic and kind of look high level. So Jose, if you want to advance the slide deck, there's many things about supporting a Windows 10 environment that's changed from Windows 7. So feature updates, what's the best approach for service rings within your organization, what's the complexities of applying these, should there be pilot groups? So let's just, let's spend about 5 minutes so we can leave some time for questions to address this topic. So, we're seeing a lot of questions around how to operationally support Windows 10 because it is such a different model than in the past. So what do you guys think about feature updates, the best way to deploy those? What are your thoughts, guys?
So it's a good thing that we probably left the least amount of time for this because I think we've already touched on a lot of this stuff. I'll just say that when you're going to a new feature update, I think it's important not to just take it as it would just be like a regular Windows update. So some of these content or feature updates can take up to 45 minutes to install. If you're not strategically applying these updates, you can take down an entire department or a mission critical piece of your business. So I think it's important to again go back to being proactive, having that up-to-date asset inventory list, knowing what devices are performing anesthesia or are for clinician documentation, or gosh, are doing payroll, whatever that functionality is. And we need to make sure we have a plan so that we're not taking down an entire department at one time. So that's kind of where I was headed with the conversation on this one. But really just making sure it's an iterative process, and you're treating each of these as its own go live, really.
Yeah. So just I wanted to touch on the asset management piece. So I've seen in the past where companies were spending a lot of money and effort with trying to figure out where their assets are, and then sometimes would abandon it for about a year or a year and a half, and then when they realize, hey, wait a minute, we're spending a lot of money on laptops or this, that, and the other, they kind of do a scan to see if the assets are where they need to be, right? But I also have seen companies where they completely just abandon that because of the fact that it was costing too much time and money to try to track these things. So that points back to device encryption, because a lot of companies are saying, hey, you know what, if one of our laptops gets stolen, that's fine. We're going to figure into our budget or figure into the formula that X amount of laptops will either get lost, stolen, so on and so forth. But what's absolutely critical is that all the data is protected. So as long as it's encrypted, we can get past the stolen device, right? As long as our data is not compromised in any way. And I'm not advising anyone one way or the other. Protect your assets and protect your data, right? But if I had to choose between the two, I'm going to go with protect the data every day of the week and twice on Sunday.
All right, awesome.
I want to make sure too on the servicing rings that you just need to make sure that you do have devices that are getting the current updates. A few of them in your environment, so people can be testing these feature updates, why they come out. Not something that's in production that that's a critical mass thing that they have to use, but you always need to make sure people are up to date. So just don't wait for the feature update to come out. Try to be proactive, and when you don't want to be forced to be on that feature update right then. So
and I usually
got to be proactive.
So even from my images, right, and when I guide other engineers in building a Windows 10 image, there's a lot of breadcrumbs and tips and tricks that you can use that you leave inside of the OS somewhere in the registry or some type of hidden folder or something that has the information that you need to be able to track which version of that image is running on that workstation, right? So what Jeff was talking about when you're talking about servicing rings, let's suppose you go into System Center Configuration Manager, which is a tool that manages all the workstations in your environment, and you say, hey, I want to see how many devices are still running Windows 10 1703. Okay, so that's fine. It's going to tell you 1703, 1709. It's going to give you a complete readout and a nice little graph on a dashboard inside the console. However, what if we develop 3 versions of 1703? So that it will not tell us, right? So by leaving some of these breadcrumbs behind, we can better manage what versions of that particular image is out there in the environment. And then at that point, we can create a solution or a strategy with upgrading it to where it needs to be, right? Because we all start at one place, right? And then we kind of finish off and finalize certain images, but we could have literally gone from like bronze, silver to gold.
Yeah. All right. I think what we'll do now is we'll open it up to some questions. I did have one question get posted during the event, and that is whether or not there will be a replay available, and there will be. So we will get that posted out through divergent.com over the course of the next day or two. One of the other questions that we saw come in, are there any challenges or key issues that you've seen when beginning the application rationalization projects? From my perspective, and guys, I'd be interested to hear what your response is, but I think one of the key challenges is actually getting a catalog of what's in the environment. especially if there's the governance structure is new, and just understanding truly what's in the environment is one of the key issues, and just challenges of getting the application rationalization component started for Windows 10. What do you guys think?
Well, let me just say something real quick, Emily. So recently, in the past 2 to 3 years, I have not presented a client with a list of software that was found in their environment where they were not surprised that they still had older versions of software, legacy software still out there, still available for deployment, right? And it's the equivalent of today's lifestyle. We all have things to do. We have to leave out and go to work. Work takes up a big piece of our lives, right? And then we come home and there are things that you have to do throughout the house to kind of maintain the home. But then, there's sometimes we walk out into the backyard, which some people don't do all the time. We walk around the house and we notice, hey, we got a shingle hanging here, or we have mold growing on the side, or the fence needs repairing. And that's kind of like what it is there's so many moving parts that it's hard to look at everything all at the same time. So if you don't know how to run certain tool sets to gather this information, it might behoove a lot of IT leadership out there to engage a firm every once in a while for just a small assessment. Come out, once every 12 months and just kind of let us know where we are. And again, it could be narrow in scope, or it can be broad. But I think it would be advantageous for any organization to do so that they can kind of keep up with the things that are coming, and also tell them what they don't know, right? And unfortunately, because technology is changing so much, we don't know what we don't know. So,
Jose, your analogies are on point today, man.
Thank you.
Jeff, you're trying to chime in there?
Yes, the stakeholders and the owners of the applications is always a really big issue. You'll go into some environments and there'll be one person that's in charge, the owner of 50 applications, or you go into another environment and nobody's the owner of the application, so it's hard to find who will be testing it and stuff like that. So that's something that needs to be always addressed when you first come in and do applications.
Yeah, that's an excellent point.
Yeah, and that was going to be my feedback. Is typically there's applications that are found, and nobody knows who owns them. So getting the validation and testing and that sort of thing done, or do we even need it anymore? Those questions are difficult to answer because we just don't know who owns the application.
Which is a key piece of the when consulting firms come in and they do some sort of analysis on applications in the environment. The first thing we do is we categorize them, and then the ones that are critical, that need some type of rationalization or compatibility check or remediation, we figure out, okay, so who is the owner of this particular application. And I'm going to be honest with you, I've been in some companies where there's certain, especially in the oil and gas industry, there's some software that is 10 gigs big, right? It takes half an hour to install, and you have to be on the phone with the vendor to kind of walk through some of the steps, right? But again, this is the type of work that needs to be done. I don't like to work on applications. I know how to. I have a lot of expertise in it. I don't like it because I've done it for so long with some of the most complex applications out there, not just from the how it works in the installations and configuration of it, but also like the deployment of it. So a lot of times we package apps, we don't know what they do or how they work, but we'll create some type of command line. We'll configure it so that it doesn't install these components, and then it will install quietly, right? But what about those applications that have proprietary switches, right? That command line to be able to deploy that application quietly, I have to be on a call with the vendor for 30 minutes to kind of figure all of that out, right? So these are the things that we mention to clients, and sometimes they're receptive, sometimes they're not. But honestly, we're living in the age that when you call out consultants and they tell you all the things that you don't want to hear, that means that IT consulting firm is is a good one and they're doing their job. Because if we're just going to sit here and pat you on the back, right, for band-aiding everything, and the problem is, you know, duct tape is only going to go but so far, right? Eventually, we're going to have to replace the piece or the entire, you know, let's just say it's a wooden desk, right? Eventually, we can't just keep patching up the legs. We're going to have to either replace some parts or replace the entire thing. But that's what these organizations need. So when we come out and we tell you certain things, we're telling you what you need to know, right? Not necessarily what you want to hear.
Yep.
But at the same time, we're doing so. It's almost like having a good friend and say, hey, listen, your hair's a little crooked today. You know, you might want to go back in the bathroom. See, someone who's not a friend is not going to tell you that, right? So that's where the partnership comes in, because we're only truly successful if you're successful. You know, there's going to be a lot of times a price tag attached to the service, right? But the long-lasting relationship is really where a true consulting firm, or that's the goal of a true consulting firm, because we don't want you to be dissatisfied, because then how would you refer anyone else to us, right? Or refer us to someone else? But at the same time, where there are other engagements, either in your organization or what have you, you know, you'll call back on us. And at the same time, there are times we call out to our partners where we've you know, completed certain projects successfully, and you know, we need some sort of reference, or we need a, you know, path forward, or we need to sit down with them for 30 minutes to figure out something in the healthcare industry, right? And they can help us, or even if we want to do surveys, right, that allow us to engage other clients, you know, in some sort of project or in solutions development. So the partnership is something that's key here, and is what we kind of focus on.
Yep, absolutely. Well, we've actually run over. I think that, yeah, I think honestly that Mike, Jeff, Jose, and I could probably continue this conversation and keep being here till 5 o'clock. We just could probably keep talking about Windows 10 and the potential impacts and just the dependency projects and work that go into a large program such as Windows 10 all day. So with that, I'm going to say that I actually was able to get through my full Starbucks venti coffee during this conversation. I know.
Glad you got it.
Yep. So I want to thank everybody who was able to attend. We will post a recording out onto our website. And Mike and Jeff and Jose, thanks you guys so much for helping to lead this conversation. And I think these were 3 great topics, and ones that often get forgotten about during the planning process, or, you know, maybe not potentially incorporated into a long enough portion of a project plan. So thanks, you guys. Thanks to everybody who was able to join us today. And I hope everyone has a great weekend. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks.
Yeah, thank you. A lot of fun.
Thanks.